When we think of medieval warfare, we imagine soldiers fearing the enemy's blade. But on the battlefield, there were fates far worse than death ones that haunted warriors long before the fight began. Number 1. Maiming and permanent injury. Medieval soldiers often feared the idea of surviving with a ruined body far more than they feared dying outright. A crushed knee from a mace, a severed hand from a sword blow, or a spear wound that tore into the shoulder could mean the end of a man's ability to work, fight, or even feed himself. Archaeological evidence from medieval battlefields shows countless cases of shattered bones, deep blade cuts, and blunt force fractures. Many injuries were aimed at disabling rather than killing, especially strikes to legs and arms that could take a man out of the fight but leave him alive to suffer. Visible wounds on the face were especially feared, not just for the pain, but for the lifelong mark they left. A disfigured face could change how others treated you, affecting marriage prospects, employment, and standing in the community. Arrows posed their own risks. Bodkin arrowheads could pierce chainmail and lodge deep in bone or muscle. Removing them was difficult, often tearing more tissue, leaving joints stiff or nerves permanently damaged. Battlefield medicine tried to keep pace, but surgical knowledge was limited. The best trained surgeons could set bones, sew cuts, and use herbal mixtures to dull pain, but they had little defense against infection. Even small wounds could become fatal within weeks due to septicemia. Some surgeons, like Hugh of Lucca and his students, began experimenting with cleaning wounds and using wine-soaked dressings, which improved survival rates for those lucky enough to reach them. But most soldiers had to rely on cauterization, crude bandages, or whatever help comrades could provide in the field. For many who survived, bones healed badly. Evidence from excavated skeletons shows crooked limbs, fused joints, and signs of arthritis from improperly healed fractures. This kind of permanent damage meant a man could no longer ride a horse, wield a weapon, or work the land effectively, stripping him of his role in both war and peacetime life. In the rigid structure of medieval society, losing the ability to labor was devastating. Wealthy knights might secure a ransom or pension, but ordinary foot soldiers had no such safety net. Disability often led to poverty, dependence on family, or begging. Soldiers saw these fates firsthand when camps turned into grim makeshift hospitals after a battle. Long lines formed for the barber surgeon, who would probe wounds, cut away dead flesh, or cauterize with red-hot iron. The smell of burned flesh, the screams of patients, and the knowledge that fever and gangrene might still come later created an atmosphere of dread. Some survivors also faced long-term neurological damage from head injuries. Impaired vision, poor balance, and memory loss were common after severe blows to the skull. Even if a soldier returned home alive, he might never be the same mentally or physically. Manuals like the Chirurgia Magna offered detailed instructions for treating compound fractures and arrow wounds, but without antiseptics or sterile environments, success rates were low. The weapons most likely to leave men maimed were ironically the ones designed to bypass armor without killing instantly. Maces, warhammers, and poleaxes could crush bones and dislocate joints while leaving organs untouched, producing survivors who would spend the rest of their lives limping or unable to lift a shield. Siege warfare only added to the risks. Falling masonry, boiling oil, or heavy projectiles from trebuchets could break bones in ways even skilled surgeons couldn't repair. The aftermath of battles also brought danger. Dirty water, crowded living conditions, and poor sanitation turned manageable wounds into slow killers. Soldiers knew that survival often meant living with constant pain, losing their role in society, and facing the pity or disdain of others. That reality, more than the idea of a quick death, was what haunted them before stepping onto the battlefield. Number 2. Captivity and torture. To a medieval soldier, the worst fate wasn't a quick end on the field, but the long, uncertain grind of being taken alive, because capture turned a fighter into currency, leverage, and sometimes a lesson to terrify others. The rules favored the valuable knights, bannerets, wealthy men-at-arms, who could expect ransom negotiations, parole on sworn oath, and a chain of guarantors back home. Yet even for them, the process could ruin a family, as relatives sold parcels of land, pledged future harvests, and borrowed at harsh rates while the captive waited in a keep or town prison, watching seasons pass. For common infantry, archers, or levy spearmen, there was often no market, which meant forced labor in siege works, hauling stones and timber, digging trenches under guard, or a march to coastal markets where prisoners could be sold into servitude on estates, or pulled to the oars of galleys, a sentence measured in blisters, salt sores, and years. Fear sharpened around interrogation. Not the sensational devices popular imagination fixates on, but simple, relentless coercion binding, suspension, beating, sleep deprivation, cold, and hunger methods designed to pry out gate codes, supply routes, and the names of officers or local allies. And because information had immediate tactical value, captors used intimidation quickly, sometimes in front of other prisoners, to break morale without leaving marks that might reduce resale value. Mutilation existed as a warning, and a policy tool ears and noses cut to mark deserters or enemy scouts, the right hand taken to stop a bowman's return to service, blinding used to neutralize experienced leaders and send a message to towns thinking about resistance. A disfigured survivor spread the story faster than any herald, and soldiers knew the shame of returning home, visibly damaged, could stalk them longer than pain itself. Ritualized humiliation could be just as corrosive. Captives paraded in chains through market squares, forced to kneel before a banner, made to carry captured standards upside down, or shaved to signal subjugation. None of this killed, but it unmade a man's public identity, and in honor-based communities, that loss stuck like a second set of shackles. Conditions inside holding sites, castle undercrofts, town jails, monastic cells requisitioned in wartime were an education in slow punishment. Cramped rooms, poor ventilation, shared straw, lice, and a steady risk of dysentery. Guards rationed food unevenly, favoring high-value prisoners who could pay for better bedding or a servant, and leaving the rest to barter clothing or future labor for scraps. A soldier might enter captivity strong and leave months later weak, half-starved, and sick, even if no blow ever fell. Parole offered one slender path. A captive knight could be released on oath to gather his ransom, sworn not to fight until the sum was paid, but breaking parole meant dishonor that closed doors to future service and might lead former comrades to shun him. Meanwhile, the debt itself could distort a career, pushing veterans into riskier campaigns, or mercenary contracts to claw back what their families had spent. Some captors pressed prisoners into auxiliary roles, camp carpenters, teamsters, even reluctant guides to local fords and byways, raising a different anxiety, that former comrades would brand them collaborators if they ever returned. And if wars crossed religious frontiers, the fear deepened with language barriers, unknown laws, and the possibility of permanent enslavement far from home. Where letters might never reach in ransom, brokers had little access. Soldiers also worried about the legal gray zone between quarter and no quarter. Surrender terms could be honored safe conduct in exchange for laying down arms, or voided after tempers cooled and commanders reconsidered costs, and stories of garrisons granted mercy one month and slaughtered the next traveled quickly along campaign roads, eroding trust. On open fields, dropping weapons and raising hands did not guarantee survival if pursuit had been bloody, or if a commander wished to make an example. Torture, when applied, wasn't always about secrets. Sometimes it served as staged theater measured, public, and targeted to warn towns against aiding raiders or to punish communities after ambushes. And that predictability made it more frightening, because men could imagine exactly how their own capture might be used. Yet even without overt cruelty, the prolonged not knowing was its own torment. Not knowing if a letter had reached home, if a lord would pay, if the next buyer would be harsher, if a swap would fall through at the last moment. All of this sat on top of spiritual and social anxieties. A prisoner could miss sacraments, fail to care for aging parents, or see his betrothal collapse. If ransom failed and sale followed, he might be absorbed into an unfamiliar household with no route back. Measured against a battlefield death that ended pain and fixed reputation, captivity threatened a slow unspooling of status, agency, and ties, years of being used rather than simply defeated, which is why so many soldiers stepped into the melee, more afraid of chains than of steel. Number 3. Starvation. During sieges. In a siege, fear worked slowly, measured not by charging cavalry, but by the shrinking pile of grain in a storeroom, and the ache that made armor feel twice as heavy, because once the gates closed, the calendar turned into arithmetic. How many mouths? How many barrels? How many days until the last ration? Commanders ordered an immediate census, locked granaries, sealed wine cellars, and posted guards on mills. Yet everyone knew the math rarely favored the garrison. The besiegers' first move was to choke supply lines burning fields, tearing up roads, blocking river traffic, and raiding outlying farms, so that even a successful sally brought back less each week. With mills outside the walls disabled, defenders scrambled to keep a few handquerns turning, but grinding was slow, exhausting work that tied up able bodies, while soldiers were needed on the parapets. Rations tightened in steps. Whole loaves became half, then black bread stretched with bran, pea flour, and whatever could be milled. Meat shifted from salted pork and beef to stringy scraps from draft animals, then horses, and finally anything that moved within the walls. A grim descent that signaled the city's pulse fading. Salt, the quiet pillar of medieval provisioning, ran out early, and without it, meat spoiled fast. Smokehouses operated day and night while fuel lasted, but firewood had its own ration cards because kitchens competed with guard posts for the same bundles of wood. Water was never just there. Cisterns had to be kept clean, and besiegers knew to foul wells with carcasses or latrine waste if they could reach them with a trebuchet. So many garrisons relied on small beer, weak ale brewed to make water safer. As grain dropped, even brewing a thin batch felt like a luxury, and men returned to risky sources that carried dysentery into barracks. Hunger eroded combat power long before anyone collapsed. Archers who could draw a heavy bow in peacetime found their strength slipping week by week. Men-at-arms avoided sprinting on the walls because a burst of effort now meant trembling legs tomorrow. Night watches stretched longer as soldiers grew slow to wake and slower to respond to alarms. Morale followed the stomach. Market prices inside the walls exploded. Those with hoards of grain turned profit into resentment, and commanders fought two-front enemy lines outside and disorder within. By setting fixed rations, distributing from central stores, and punishing speculation, but black markets still formed in shadowed doorways because hunger makes its own law. Civilians and soldiers did not experience scarcity equally. Garrisons tried to evacuate non-combatants under flags of truce to save food, and sometimes besiegers allowed it. But other times, crowds were forced back to the walls, creating a tragic buffer that drained stores faster and weighed on the conscience of those holding the keys. Chronic undernourishment carried specific signs: swollen gums, slow wound healing, constant chills, muscles that cramped on the ladders, and a fog of irritability that made small disputes dangerous. Priests and physicians urged broths from bones and herbs from rooftop gardens, but vitamins were not a medieval concept, and deficiency crept in anyway. Siege manuals advised stockpiling fodder for animals, because when people eat barley and oats, horses starve, yet cavalry was the fastest messenger a garrison had. Sending a rider to beg relief was a calculation. Feed the horse now and lose 10 men's bread later, or keep the grain and lose the only way to call for help. Psychological warfare leaned hard on hunger. Besiegers lit bonfires where defenders could see spits turning, catapulted loaves as mockery, or offered food to prisoners within sight of the walls. Trumpets at mealtimes cut deeper than insults, and a kitchen's smell drifting on a favorable wind could sap will more effectively than arrows. Leather boiling, rats snared, dogs and pigeons missing from Ali's chronicles list these not for shock value, but because they mark a predictable downward slope. Each step a signpost that terms of surrender would soon appear on a parchment. Some cities tried organized foraging sorties at dawn, tight bands who knew every hedge and ditch, but repeated losses made them prohibitively expensive in blood relative to the crumbs returned. Inside, bakers became logisticians, calculating daily flour yields, humidity, oven capacity, and the trade-off between small loaves that cooked fast and larger ones that wasted less moisture. They fought the same enemy as the captains did, just with scales and peels instead of spears. Commanders kept a last secret reserve grain for a final week or two. so they could negotiate from a position that still looked steady. If the enemy suspected those bins were nearly empty, terms hardened and mercy thinned. Even when relief armies approached, defenders sometimes hesitated to sortie because starvation had turned trained units into brittle formations that might break under a simple feint. Victory from relief could still feel like defeat if the garrison lacked the strength to hold the gate open. Winter compounded everything. Short days for firewood collection inside the walls, longer nights for shivering, frozen cisterns, and bread that crumbled because flour took on damp. Summer had its own punishments in rot, insects, and warm water that carried disease faster. Starvation also shifted loyalties. A watchman who once scorned bribes might trade a quiet gate for a sack of wheat when his child's belly pinched, so commanders rotated posts, doubled inspections at dawn, the hungriest hour, and threatened exemplary punishment while quietly organizing extra porridge for guards with families. In the end, hunger's power lay in its patience. It could not be parried or outdueled, only prepared for, and preparation depended on disciplined stockpiles, clean water systems, protected mills, fair rationing, and the will to maintain order when every day asked the same question: how much longer can we last, and who grows weaker first, us or them? Number 4. Disease in the camps. Medieval armies feared disease because it attacked the one thing a soldier needed most: the steady body that could march, dig, haul, and fight. And it did so invisibly, long before swords crossed. A camp that looked strong at dawn could be half usable by dusk if the latrines were placed uphill from the water point, or if yesterday's butchered carcasses lay uncovered near the cook fires. The common killers had plain names: bloody flux for dysentery, camp fever for typhus, agues for periodic fevers, pox and measles that swept through new levies. But the pattern was the same: crowd people, animals, and refuse together. Add warm weather or a wet spell. Then watch strength ebb in ways no armor could block. Logistics made things worse because food moved slowly and spoiled quickly. Flour clumped with damp, salted meat turned slimy if the barrel hoops loosened, and fish stank if a wagon broke an axle on a rutted road. Commanders issued orders: dig pits for waste, keep kitchens downwind, bury offal, boil water if you must, but discipline frayed under fatigue, and a single rainstorm could flood latrines and bring filth into trenches. Water itself was a trap. Rivers looked clean, but carried upstream waste. Shallow wells inside temporary lines were easy to foul. And when the beer ran thin, men drank straight from ditches, trading thirst for cramps and fever 2 days later. Horses and oxen multiplied the problem, because fodder heaps, manure, and flies wrapped the camp in a veil of contagion. Once diarrhea began, men dehydrated fast, and the strongest archers lost their draw weight. Medical help existed, but it was a narrow bridge over a wide river. A physician might prescribe rest, controlled diet, or vinegar rinses. An apothecary could offer simples like mint, plantain, or willow. And barber surgeons kept knives keen for wounds, yet had little to offer against a fever that needed clean water and quiet. When battle followed a march through marshland, intermittent fevers cut files in half. When a siege dragged on, lice spread from blanket to blanket, and the scratching never stopped until men grew dull-eyed and slow. Disease also warped decisions. Scouts returning with chills pushed commanders to delay a sortie. Carts meant for arrows carried sick men instead. Spare horses hauled water to a distant spring because the near one made everyone worse, burning precious strength before a single trumpet sounded. Camp layout mattered as much as tactics. Units that kept strict waistlines, rotated kitchen sites, and assigned water parties to guarded sources lost fewer men than those who treated hygiene as an afterthought. Even then, a sudden influx of camp followers, families, traders, smiths, could double the mouths and halve the margin for error. After a battle, the risk spiked again. Corpses swelled in the heat, pits filled too shallow, and flies moved from dead flesh to dinner, while wounded men, unable to reach the latrines, contaminated the very ground where orderlies worked. Winter did not spare armies, it merely changed the enemy. Snow hid filth until thaw. Men huddled tighter around smoky fires and coughed through the night. damp wool never fully dried, and chilblains opened paths for infection. Some are punished in another way. Barrels leaked in heat, water turned green, and every cut festered. Trying to outrun sickness, some leaders marched their troops to higher, breezier ground, but that strained supply lines and cost time. Others enforced daily brewing of weak ale to replace suspect water, accepting lower grain stocks in exchange for fewer funerals. Records from garrisons show the blunt arithmetic: 1,000 men on paper, 700 on the line, 400 truly fit, and the drop explained not by enemy shock, but by latrines, kitchens, and water jars. Veterans learned to fear the quiet signs: a quartermaster who started hiding barrels, a cook who thinned porridge beyond reason, wells edged with algae, a hospital tent that never emptied. Morale followed the thermometer and the stomach. A camp that smelled clean and ate hot meals could face a long march, but one that reeked of sour waste and rot argued with itself, deserted posts, and snapped at orders. In letters home, soldiers promised courage under steel. In murmurs by the cook fires, they begged for dry straw, boiled water, fresh shirts, and fewer flies. They knew steel would test them once. Disease tested them every hour, grinding down bodies and numbers until the enemy outside the ditch looked almost secondary. That is why men who trusted their shields and harnesses still dreaded the camp's small, ordinary failures. The latrine dug in the wrong spot, the carcass left 1 hour too long, the water drawn from the easy place instead of the safe one. Because those decisions decided who reached the next battle standing and who never left his blanket. Number 5. Dishonor and social ruin. In a medieval army, men feared disgrace because it did not end with the day's fighting. It reached into property, kinship, work, credit, and even salvation. And once a name slipped from honorable to shameful, every gate grew heavier. Honor was more than pride. It was a practical asset that unlocked service, pay, and protection. A knight's oath tied him to his lord, his companions, and his dependents, and breaking it by fleeing with the standard, abandoning a post, or refusing a muster, could be judged as felony under feudal custom, bringing forfeiture of fiefs, loss of wardships, and eviction from a network of obligations that kept households afloat. Degradation rituals made the loss visible: spurs hacked off, a sword snapped, a shield inverted, a harness stripped in front of witnesses. These were not theatrical extras, but legal signals that a man no longer qualified for the rights of his rank. Reputation also governed ransom and parole. Captivity was a marketplace built on trust. A man known for keeping his word could be released to collect his ransom on oath. A man branded false had to rot in a cell or serve hard labor because no one would risk him. Dishonor throttled the flow of credit too. Warfare ran on loans from merchants, advances from armorers, and delayed wages. If a captain's name turned sour after a rout, creditors tightened terms, gear became harder to hire, and the defeated man found himself priced out of the next campaign. In towns and communes, civic statutes tied military service to citizenship. Desertion could mean fines, exclusion from guild benefits, or loss of market rights, which turned a soldier's private failure into a family's public hardship. Social life followed the same logic. Marriage negotiations weighed lineage and conduct. A stain on a banner narrowed options for sons and daughters, and the wrong kind of fame cowardice, treachery, or habitual pillage of one's own side could block alliances that mattered more than romance. Clerical censure carried its own edge. Excommunication for oath-breaking or violent sacrilege cut a man from sacraments and charity, made burial uncertain, and warned communities to treat him warily. Many soldiers cared about that not only for spiritual reasons, but because a man outside the church's peace had fewer mediators if things went wrong. Within companies, honor worked as discipline. Commanders needed files that stood fast when horns sounded, so they used collective bonds, mutual sureties, shared loot, paired sleeping arrangements to make desertion costly for friends as well as for the deserter. And they backed that with penalties that escalated from fines and loss of shares to flogging and, in extreme cases, execution by one's own unit. Cowardice did not always mean running. It could mean disobeying a dangerous order, failing to support a neighbor's shield when the push of pike came, or spreading panic with rumors. Chroniclers remembered those lapses, and memory was a weapon. A single episode, retold at fair days and musters, could shadow a career years later. Tournaments and military orders reinforced the code. A man suspected of craven conduct might be barred from lists, refused entry to an order, or placed under inquiry by heralds. Without those stages to display skill and win patrons, advancement stalled. Even minor signs of unreliability, breaking parole early, cheating at shares, lying about prisoners, stacked up until captains stopped writing a man's name on muster rolls. Dishonor could also flow from the opposite sin: reckless glory-seeking that ignored orders, jeopardized formations, and wasted lives. Medieval tactics prized cohesion. A brilliant lone charge that broke the line of battle could be judged a fault, not a feat, and a captain who could not control his hotspurs risked censure from his lord and complaints from allied contingents. Communities punished betrayal harshly. In border regions and civil wars, houses of convicted traitors might be razed, coats of arms defaced, and names erased from local records. Widows and orphans paid the price in diminished dowries and disputed inheritances. And beyond law and ritual lay the quiet economics of shame. A man marked as a coward found it harder to rent land, to join a convoy as a guard, or to secure a place in a retinue heading to a campaign that promised wages. In a world where war and work overlapped, losing honor meant losing options. That is why soldiers cared as much about witnesses as about wounds. They drilled to hold formation because failure would be seen. They kept oaths under pressure because the next contract depended on it. They risked themselves to recover a fallen banner because symbols were receipts of credibility. Death could be tidy. Disgrace lingered, accumulated interest, and followed a family, sometimes for generations, in the whispers that mattered most when the fighting stopped.